education, understanding, getting to a place where you do know what's happening around you and in you is a critically important part of why you're sitting here even today. This Identity Matters was put together as a vehicle, I guess, for all of us here. And I learn something every time I come in here, every day, every time I'm here. And I hopefully you do. And because part of the battle that we fight out there, the devil, the enemy that's prowling around, wants to keep us ignorant. He wants to keep us from understanding God's intent for our life. And I think it's more obvious when it comes to subject matters like this. I remember not that long ago hearing this for the first time. Is there a few people in here that, is this like the first time you understood neuroplasticity or heard anything like this, right? Okay, yeah. I mean, it's huge because now you can draw on information or knowledge or education to help understand what is happening in this world around us, because it seems confusing at times. It seems hard. It's really hard. And so I think that fancy word, double entendre, identity matters, and identity matters. Okay? It's really important that we understand ourselves from the inside out. We talked about knowing God, and then reflect in that blog post. It's sort of, it's everything you believe about yourself and about the environment around you has to do with your understanding of God or your lack of understanding. We listened to the Bible in a year, and there's a guy by the name of Nicky Gumbel who narrates a portion of that before we listen to Scripture, and he kind of tells the big story of the Scriptures you're going to hear for the day. It's really cool. It's on the YouVersion app if you ever want to do Bible in a year and then have him read to you ahead of time. Fascinating. He's the vicar, they call her, basically a pastor at HTB. It's one of the bigger fellowships or congregations in Great Britain, in London, that area. Well, he was an atheist before he turned to Christ, and now he's worldwide. Now he's leading people down a path of understanding in Scripture, educating them, helping them to understand what God's intent was for us. And it's great. It's fascinating to hear his story, because when he really sorted it out in his head, he said he didn't believe in God, but what brought him around is the inability to deny what exists around us. You just can't deny that the God exists. Something had to create this fascinating thing, our brain, with billions of neurons, as many as in the galaxy. It's like that is just 260 miles an hour to get to a response in your body every time. The minute I think about it, it's already done. A second. And so as I looked at that, and if you get a chance, pull this out if you have it in your packet. It's called The Structures of Healing. And so to understand what we're going to talk about in the next couple minutes, we're about halfway through this 8 weeks. This I would put at the core of everything that we're trying to communicate to you and educate you about. Because it is sort of a diagram, and a lot of us are visual. We're going to get into the tree in a minute and talk about what that means visually. We're visual learners. I think something like 60-70% of the population loves to learn visually, seeing things. Combine that with reading and audio, and now you've got ways of changing your brain, okay? So let's take a look at this for just a minute. And I'm going to use a real-life situation because they're always best. Colleen talked a lot about her father and about the image she saw of him being that same image that she had of God. That's just the way it works, guys. Like the people that are influential in our lives, if you think about it, it could be your parents, it could be a caregiver if you didn't grow up in a household where your parents were there, or just one parent. Someone who you see as an authority figure or influenced you all along the way. I had a coach in high school. Huge influence on my life, and not in a good way. Okay, I played baseball. I played ball all the way from Little League all the way through college. And I'll tell you a story about that in a minute. But that influence had everything to do with me in my formidable years coming up with conclusions about life, about people, about relationships. And in my situation, and we'll look at the top of the chart here, life situation, we're in a life situation right now, every one of us. We're here. Whether we want to be or not, we're here. But God's got you right in this place at this time for a reason. Okay, so I grew up also in a home, like Colleen. I had probably pretty similar, like her dad was a little younger than my dad, but the same generation. And it was interesting because this morning this just came up to me. He, too, was a very authoritarian, very tough, nose to the grindstone kind of guy. He didn't come to know the Lord till he was probably 40 years old. I was born right around the same time. He's 40, my mom's 37. So a little later than usual, like the stories go. But when I looked at his background, because he didn't talk a lot about that, I might have mentioned this here before, but he was a World War II veteran. He was in the Philippines, in New Guinea during the war, and he saw some horrific stuff. And he was, in some ways, I was really proud of him in that after I understood this, he became a master sergeant, like it's an E8. It's pretty, like within 2 years, he's a master sergeant, which is pretty significant. If anybody's been in the military, you understand that doesn't happen quickly. He was in charge of a whole ordnance group in the Philippines, and so he saw some pretty tough stuff. But he never talked about it. And I know there were impacts on his life that I never will understand. I just won't. He was alone at 18 years old. His father died, who moved out of that. They split with his mother, and he moved to Virginia. My dad was 18 in high school when his dad died of appendicitis in his 30s. So he was left as the oldest in the family at 18 to kind of navigate this whole situation. It was hard. He was a tough guy, and he didn't show emotion. He didn't really do much in terms of a relationship with me. I never quite understood where he was in it. I only remember one time he ever told me he loved me, only once, and it was at a pretty traumatic time in my life. So he just didn't communicate that way. And what I remember this because there was an angry streak in him, and I can understand why after knowing his story a little better. And just because he got saved didn't mean everything was going to change internally, right? That's what healing is about. That's what the structures of healing is about that I'm about to share with you. Because if we don't get to the deepest levels of the wounding that he experienced in his life, for example, we can't deal with the emotions that come up. We can't deal with sometimes the weird, dysfunctional, sort of sinful behaviors and really get to the root and heal them from the inside out. It's an outside-in response a lot of times. And my dad would never sit down with a counselor, so that's just not an option. Okay. But I was I thought of this, but it's a great example. I'm in church. Now, who does this? I don't know, my dad. So we're in church, and it was a congregational meeting. I'm in my teens, and I don't even remember the conflict with one of the deacons in the church. Right? Now, this was a pretty fundamental church, Brethren church growing up. It wasn't a big congregation, maybe 100 people. But I remember an argument that ensued between him. This isn't like 100 people in the room. Between him and they disagreed on something. Like my dad's on his feet, and they're screaming at each other in this meeting about something completely, for no reason whatsoever, they should be screaming at each other. I literally thought they were going to get into a fight in church, like physical fight. And so I felt, you talk about triggering emotions, like like this is my dad. I'm up, I'm ready. Let's do this. Whatever we got to do. And I'm not a fighter, I'm not that kind of guy. And I just remember the anger, and then somebody kind of intervened, and everybody sat down and relaxed a little bit. And I was like, holy cow, how do you interpret that set of circumstances? There's never any conversation that should be had, especially in church, I would think, where there's going to come to fisticuffs over it, right? But that was the way he responded to tough, stressful situations. I saw that my whole life. If I did anything he deemed as being wrong, the belt literally would come out, and I'd get beat. I'd usually head to my room because I knew it was coming, cover up, stick my butt up, hit the air. It's not nearly as painful if you hit somewhere else. Okay, that's it. Whether I deserved it or not, I got it. As an only child, pretty much I got blamed for everything, right? So if something went wrong, it's my fault because I'm the only guy there. Okay, so that was it. Couldn't blame my friends, couldn't blame anybody else. I'm it. And so that was my view of who God was in my life. Like, okay, if I disobey in some way, I break the norms of society, I better jump to the side because a lightning bolt's coming and I'm in trouble. How does that play out in your life, in my life? Okay, let's look at this for a second. Life situation. Give you an example. Let's say I get in an argument with my wife, which never happens, by the way. Just doesn't happen. She's too lovable. Can't do it. But I do, and I get upset. And I'm like, okay, I'm out. I head to Joe's bar, and I drop a few shots at the keel and whatever else feels good. What is that? Is that a dysfunctional behavior, sort of? Yeah, bad life situation. I run out, take a few shots, I feel better. Well, do I really? No. Okay. So emotionally speaking, I'm still in upheaval. Right here, follow me down, right? There's an emotional upheaval taking place in my life right at this moment. All right? This hasn't happened, so just hypothetical. Just saying. Why am I in emotional upheaval? Because there are lies, there are things that have been sown into my life that I believe are true of me. Okay, we got an argument. How do I settle that if I'm really honest? Should I take it personally? No, I've got a view, she's got a view. Should we sit down and work it out? I watched my father act it out instead of talking it out. Okay? And numerous occasions, that was my model. Hugely impactful in my life. I'll give you another example because the wounds, and I'll share one of those with you personally, that happened to me, that really drove a lot of why my behavior at an earlier kind of early 20s, late 20s, and I'll give you some stories about that age, why that turned out to be a wrong response that landed me in some pretty tough situations. Actually, it landed me in prison. Believe that or not. Can you believe it? It's crazy. Yes, it did. And I'll tell you about that. But think about this. I told you about as a baseball player. Okay. So I pitched, I played shortstop, first base, pretty decent player. As I said, I played all the way through college. Wasn't pro material, but I usually in high school or in Babe Ruth summer ball, I'd be hitting in the third or fourth position in a lineup, which is usually reserved for the better hitters or guys that are more power hitters. I wasn't that as much. But this was the summer of '76. You know how old I am. Second year, between my first and second year of college. And summer ball, like the teams are pretty competitive. And so I'm pitching in this game. And if you're an athlete or if you've ever been in a situation, you could even be a chess player. Like the perfect moves, right? It's checkmate. Like does that ever happen? Every move, boom, 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 boom. You take every player, you checkmate, it's over. Okay, especially if you're highly competitive, rarely. I'm in a game where I'm pitching, and 9-inning game, I threw a no-hitter, one-hitter. No-hitter was the goal. I threw a one-hitter. Now, I also hit the home run. It was a 2-run home run that scored the only runs we really needed to win the game. The only thing I did was gave up one hit the entire game. That was it. In fact, I have the baseball right here. Crazy, right? So I think I have it here. There it is. It's in front of me, the notorious one-hitter, I call it. Okay? And so on it, June 22nd, 1976, Babe Ruth baseball, threw a one-hitter, hit a 2-run home run. I kept it. Because it was one of those moments where, like, this just doesn't happen every day, right? Anybody knows, Roy Halladay, who threw, like 2 or 3 perfect games? That's crazy, right? He's in the Hall of Fame. Well, not in the Hall of Fame, but, it felt that way. Like, I was in the Hall of Fame that day. Okay? It meant everything to me. I got into the car afterwards. My girlfriend at the time, who I ended up marrying later, not this one, that's another story. High school sweetheart, she said, we're in the back seat, like we're going out for ice cream, we're doing something to celebrate. And my dad's sitting in the front seat, kind of like quiet, looks back at me and he says, man, if it weren't for that one hit, it would have been a perfect game. Man, like total disapproval, conditional love, got to be about performance. Man, one more. He gave up that one hit. Are you kidding me? Like, what's a perfect game? Really? Is it, I don't know, 3 pitches an inning? They fly out each time. You pitch 27 pitches. Game's over. Nobody gets a hit. Or is it you strike everybody out on 3 pitches? Or something different, like I did, all but one hit. That's still like. So how do you achieve perfection in life? Is that really achievable? Well, my dad thought so, obviously. Guys, that was a wound that's sunk deeply into my soul. I haven't forgot it to this day, probably a momentum as a result of that, but it said something about my identity. It said, hey, man, like you're just not good enough, you know? Like you're never going to be good enough. It's not quite what I had hoped for when I had you as my son. Like you got to do better, man. Like you got to do better. And so those messages, I carried that throughout my entire life until I got what this means, until I understood the tree of brokenness, until I got the fact that there are wounds on the inside that really needed to be healed by God before we really understand our identity in Him, I bought into the lie that I could never make it. I'm just not good enough to make it in this world. Like it just isn't going to happen. So I was like on hyper overdrive to prove Him wrong and anybody else that would listen. Anybody else at all. Words matter. Check this out. Words matter. If you include scientific words, there are over 1 million words in the English language. That's a lot of words. The average person knows 20,000 words. Did you know you knew 20,000 words? I didn't. I had no idea. That's a lot. We use 2,000 different words in a week. 2,000 a week. Which means that's only 10% of the words we actually know. 16,000 words a day, unless your Colleen is about 32,000. Oops, sorry, I picked on you. She uses them all, and mine, and yours. 16,000 words a day. Well, 2,000 different words a week means we're using a lot of the same words over and over again every day. Here's the thing at the bottom, what I wrote here. Your words matter. However, what matters most is not the number of words you speak, but the kind of words you choose and the purpose for which you use them. Does that make sense? Man, if it weren't for that one hit, man, it would have been a perfect game. Words matter.
Excuse me, 1 million words in the English language?
Roughly. Yeah. That's a lot of words. And so we talk about brain power. We don't use anywhere near the percentage. There are words, like, go look at the dictionary, right? That's a lot of words in a dictionary. It's about that thick. It's crazy, crazy. The tree. You all have a picture of the tree. Again, visually speaking, pull it out if you have it in there. We talk about core longings. You know, if we go back to the garden, every need we ever had or every longing that ever was sown into our life was met by God when He made us to be us. Every longing was met in Him. Everyone. Like we didn't really understand the word wounds or brokenness they were probably not part of the 1 million word vocabulary. Of course, they weren't speaking English either, so I don't know what they were speaking. You know, we think we're at the center of the universe and everything's English. Guess we realized until the Tower of Babel came along, maybe there was one language. Now there's like more than I can count. But those core longings that are listed here, belonging, love, understanding, significance, security, purpose, everyone figured it out. No mean words, none of that. But what happened when we chose to eat of that tree of knowledge and good and evil and be like God, everything changed. Now all those longings were kind of left up to ourselves. Like we had a choice and we decided, well, we can do this. Like I can navigate life, I can make it on my own. And what happened in the meantime, we lost the connection. Like why is that a barren tree? Like if you have roots, if your root system looked like this with breaks in it, would there be any way to get nutrients to it, right? So this is a pretty nasty looking tree. That's what they look like in the winter. Thank God made spring and leaves and water and ways for them to be rejuvenated. But this is the life that we have to navigate through the sin that came into our lives. So identity is the trunk. That's the trunk. That says, you know what, this is who God says I am. I said I am somebody else. Lauren Daigle shared that with us. I love that song. Because what he says of us is a lot different than what we say of ourselves or what our significant others say about ourselves, or our parents say, or somebody else says. Because we live in a world broken that says, you know what, it's really about me. So if I can find a way to shift the narrative over to how bad someone else is, it takes the focus off of me in terms of my own issues. And so let's cast blame, right? Who did Eve blame? Who did Adam blame? Eve. Who did Eve blame? Right? And eventually, didn't really the serpent, isn't as representation as Satan, like, did he make the same decision as Adam and Eve? He said, hey, I want to be on high. I want to be the guy that rules around here. Which I scratch my head at that, because it's like, holy cow. He saw all this. Like, all of a sudden, angels were created from a being that existed forever, and I'm going to rebel against that? Well, basically, that's what we did too. It's hard to understand. This is the result. And so the things on the structures of healing, the areas that we deal with, and the wounds in the trunk of in the root system, broken from our connection with God, creates all kinds of weird behaviors that come out of it. So we're talking about, and the emotional upheaval means that we've decided that I'm going to feel better if I go do a few shots, right? Which you may for a few minutes, right? Till a hangover, or the next morning, or till you realize what you did, and you're like, oh, you know, or you went out and got into a fight, or my dad decided to punch the guy in church. That would have been pretty dramatic, wouldn't it? Thankfully, he didn't. But that anger that existed in him, I realized it existed in me. I have stories back in those Little League years. I remember throwing the ball, throwing the bat, throwing the helmet, getting really ticked off if I struck out. I'd head to the dugout. I mean, there's all this stuff. And I go, where did that all come from? Well, it came from a guy that modeled that in my life. So let's step out of the darkness into the light, and let's see what God's model looks like, because these behaviors of, and it's just a few isms in the top of the tree. If you look real close, you can see them written in the tree. Alcohol, codependency, religion, sex, work, drugs, gambling, food, you name your ism. Mine was performance. Mine was trying to get my own needs met in my own way, which is significantly because I felt my core longings weren't being met, except in how I could get it done. That core longing of significance, security, purpose even. Like I didn't feel significant. I decided differently. I knew better than God. So, like in my mid-20s, most of my career was in business. So I went on, got undergrad in business and got an MBA in marketing. I got hired into the business world, and then eventually was able to do some things on my own. So I had my own businesses. It's the first opportunity to do that was in my late 20s. That's pretty good. I was part of a group of guys that was put together to start this consulting firm in Philly, and we had some office space downtown, which was pretty impressive. I mean, if anybody knows Philly, Broad and Spruce, there's a Kimmel Center is right there now. It's the Kimmel Arts Center right there. Next to it is a building called the Atlantic Building. It's right across from the DoubleTree, I think now, or I'm not sure what's there now. But we were on the 18th floor of this building. We occupied 10,000 square feet, and corner offices were, like, I could see the Delaware Memorial Bridge on a clear day. It was pretty impressive, okay, I thought. And we built a business from nothing to just millions in assets, right? Millions in revenue stream, and I became, over time in my early 30s, worth a lot of money. And I remember still how that all came about. It was all about me striving to prove something. So nothing wrong with wealth, nothing wrong with making money or doing something at that level, unless it's your little g God and it's an ism, which it was. It was something I was driving for apart from God. Like, God wasn't in this equation, okay? He's in the back seat somewhere letting me get myself into a jam, because he thought, well, look, I saved this guy. I accepted Jesus when I was 9 years old. I went sideways, and he said, well, all right, go ahead. You get out there, kid. You can do this, but I'll watch from here, and I'll let things happen, develop, and there are consequences to our choices, and that's exactly what happened to me. So we build this little mini empire, and I'm driving around in my Lincoln Town car, 85, by the way, big one. Remember this big Lincoln? Man, that was like the biggest car on the street. I had to have the biggest car on the street. Like, come on, I had to. 2 phone lines in it. That's when cell phones were like as big as my head. Like, big had to pick them up, right? You get little squiggly antennas on the top, and guys, younger people have no idea what I'm talking about. $4 a minute for the phone call, okay? Like, but nobody else had them, right? I did. It was pretty cool. Like, I'm calling landlines, but I thought this was pretty impressive, right? Had my boat on the Chesapeake Bay. I built oceanfront property out of North Carolina, real estate all over the place. My little empire, okay, my little empire. Whew. So many stories. I'm going to give you the short version. I made the mistake of getting unequally yoked. Guys know what that means? The Bible says, hey, like, you know, especially not just in marriage, but in business, partnerships, pay attention to who you're yoking with, who you're coming alongside of. These guys didn't care about anything about making money. Of course, that was me too. But when the push came to shove, the Holy Spirit in me, like we talked about last week, who was kind of in behind the scenes, and I'm making my own way, finally made his way around to the place I'm like, oh my gosh, am I in trouble? Because in the late 80s, for many of you, again, that might have been alive, it was, 80s was just a like explosion in real estate and values and just a lot of opportunity in business. But in the late 80s, when interest rates were like through the roof and inflation went out of control and you had all kinds of other things happening, that market dried up. That was the area in which we consulted in real estate investing, and we were doing a lot of it on our own. Well, as things started to diminish, one of my partners thought, you know what, we got to solidify this. I'm going to do something to make this, to hold on to this empire. So he decided to set up these kind of phony references, let's call them. People that did business with us that weren't real, to help people understand just how successful they would be if they joined our firm or were part of the services that we provided. That's not legal, right? That's fraud. Okay? Now I'm sort of doing my thing, burying my head in the sand, which, by the way, is not a defense. If anybody who's stood before a court of law, you realize that the ostrich defense, like, oh, I had no idea. Like, oh, I mean, I really wasn't involved, but that's called willful blindness. That's not a defense. Ultimately, that's what happened. When I was 32, after a ton of investigations by somebody who was a disgruntled employee, went to the authorities, and before you know it, there's an investigation going on in the firm, and when the indictments were handed down, it was for mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, racketeering, which I still don't quite understand that. That sounds like a mob thing, right? I don't understand it. But I pled guilty to ultimately mail fraud, and I was cooperating because at that point, the Holy Spirit did get a hold of me, did help me understand, but not before I tried in every effort that I could to change things first, before I gave control back to the person who created me. And that story landed me. I waited 5 years as a 5-year statute of limitation. I had to live through all of these grand jury hearings, key testimony, witness for the prosecutor, my partners, all the things that went down. And I stood before the judge and the day that I had to be sentenced because I wasn't getting off scot-free and all the guidelines. And again, mid-'80s, right, late 80s. If you all know, drug laws really got tough back then. Sentencing guidelines went through the roof. The numbers were off the charts. So you were looking at, for minor offenses, you know, remember, and then later there's a 3-strike rule, all this stuff, right? So you have a lot going on that paralleled even white-collar crimes in terms of the points that they assign. This is feds now, okay? It's feds, which is even worse. So I'm standing before the judge, and he says to me, after character witness after character witness, I'm already plugged into my local church. A lot of things have happened over those 5 years. And I was looking at probably 2.5, 3 years in prison, in federal prison, which club fed, you know, federal prison camp. Not necessarily behind the razor wire, walking free, sort of, but not really. And I sat there and I'm like, Lord, I don't know where life is taking me right now, but I don't want to do it like this anymore. I don't want to do it my way. I want to do it your way. But I'm prepared to take the consequences no matter what. And you know, God is so gracious, right? He is more than gracious. There is no the attorney that was representing me, I think he's Jewish by heritage, not much by faith, just watched miracle after miracle after miracle. We stood before the judge, and when on that day of sentence, he said to me, he said, I can see that you got caught up into something. He said, so I can't do nothing about that. So I'm going to sentence you to 90 days, 3 months, federal prison, 5 years probation, and I had a $30,000 restitution. By this time, all of my money's gone, by the way. Lost it all. Lost everything. Systematically, God took it away and stripped me of all my dependence upon anything but him. And so it was a huge relief. And my experience there, to this day, and I wrote about it. I finished a manuscript not long ago for a book that I'll probably be releasing sometime this year. And it's fascinating to see the journey that led up to that, during, and after. It was the beginning of my own healing journey. It was the beginning of a turnaround in my life that would bring me to this place today. Like, there's no way I'd be here today without surrendering myself to what God had for me, not what I had for myself. And so there's story after story, and I journaled during those 90 days, and I kept detailed, like, what was God sharing with me in my life? What are the relationships like there? And it was, he shifted the entire trajectory of my life through that one experience. Because had I followed through, or had he allowed me to go that path, my life would never be the same. It's not who I was meant to be. It's not the calling that God laid on my life. It is not who he says I am, what's true of me. I don't have to prove anything. I don't have to perform. I don't have to please people. I don't have to earn a lot of money. My balance sheet has nothing to do with my value. It has everything to do with who God says I am, a child, his kid. I'm his kid. I'm a kingdom kid. And sometimes we act like little kids, and that's okay because he loves it, because that's really who we are in his eyes. Just little kids, and we're down here, and he just wants to pat us on the butt too. Get back in the game. It's going to be okay. If you guys sitting here today, you wonder, well, why am I here? Is it just part of your story? Like, that's part of my story. I didn't talk about that for 20 years. 20 years. I didn't want to. I was ashamed. Like, that is not a story I feel like I wanted to share with people. Why? Because I'm going to be judged by it. Like, somebody's going to look at me and go, oh, my gosh, you don't look like a guy that should be in federal prison somewhere. Well, what's a guy that look like? What's he look like? What's she look like? It's in here. Everything's in here. It's all that matters is what's going on internally. About 2 months ago, I went back down to the church that I kind of attended, Calvary Chapel in Philadelphia. We were down there. This is when all this happened. I was there, and I got the support of the pastoral staff. I was at the time that the sentence hit. I was in youth ministry. I was doing a lot of stuff. I had the support of a decent-sized fellowship of people and brothers and sisters in the Lord. It's why I think it mattered. And there's a guy that I knew in high school back in the day when I was throwing one-hitters. That was college, but even in high school. He came up to me again just a couple months ago, and we just started chatting. And I told him he knew my first wife really well, and that's another a difficult story, but it's one that did not end well. And he said, because we were talking about that, and he knew her, and he knew me, and we played sports together. We played baseball together in high school, and he said, something that I thought of, and I asked him, like, what are his thoughts, like, about all of this? He goes, one thing I remember, he says, you were a great guy, a really good athlete. He said, but what I remember, and this hit me like a ton of bricks, that you were always striving. In high school, I never saw that. I didn't understand it. Why was I always striving? Well, all this, all the wounds, all the stuff I'm trying to do to fill the voids, it's my game. We had an old saying back in the day, God is my co-pilot. That's not true. He's the guy flying the plane. Okay. I have nothing to do with it. I'm just a passenger. Yet, in this story, I was his co-pilot. Guys, you have an opportunity to change the entire trajectory, like I did, of your life by surrendering your will, by surrendering everything that God everything the enemy has told you about yourself as lies, and dig deep at the wound level. Understand what God really says. Sit in intimacy. Sit in intimacy with him. He will reveal this stuff. Do you think all this? I've left out most of the story. 10 years ago, God met me in another way to just change every perspective that I had of my father when he died. I just dug deep into what that was all about. I revisited where he grew up. I looked at where his father lived and what was going on in his life, and God revealed stuff to me I never saw. This one hitter was the one of many, but he helped heal those wounds. I went back to that God. Jesus took me back to that moment, and he showed me. He said, no. It's like Jesus was in the front seat, and he's just looking at me, and he's smiling. He's saying, no. I pitched a perfect game for you. Like, you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to please me. You just have to be who I created you to be. Just sit in that. Like, just enjoy the fact that I love you. She put something on. This could make me cry. She said, God said to me that he is so proud of who you are today. Not who you were before, but who you are right now. You don't have to strive, guys. You just got to lay it down. Let him love you. He'll change it. Change it all. Let me pray for you, and hopefully this was helpful in a way that will get you to think differently about your relationship with him, differently about what's available to you all, not this false self, this change will happen from the inside out. This trig would be more meaningful. I would encourage you this week to sit with this. Everybody has a copy. Sit with the structures of healing. I didn't get into lengthy detail there. Colleen will get into a little bit more of her story around that too. Sit with that and ask God. Just quietly say, Lord, what do you want to show me that's true of me, not what I believe about myself, about you, about everything around me and my relationships. God, you show me what it is you want to show. Show me. Tell me. Speak to my heart. Open up and let him do it. Father, I just thank you, Lord, for just the opportunity to sit and share from your heart, not mine, Lord. This is your story, not mine. I'm just a vessel in which you have delivered a message. And I pray, Lord, that you would sink this deep into each one of our souls and our hearts and our minds and our understanding of who you are. Begin to reform those neural pathways in each one of us. Take those billions of neurons and reshape our belief and our understanding of who you are, who we are, who you say we are, and how we can impact the world around us by just being okay. Just being okay. Just being a kid. Just being your kid, willing to hear from you, willing to love you, willing to sit in your presence and share our hearts honestly and authentically before you. And I pray, Lord, the deepest recesses of your heart just show your love for us the same way. In your name, amen.